Good morning. Welcome to our third Rising Powers Initiative event at Boston University. We are delighted to welcome you to, as you know, our newly launched program at BU, which studies five rising powers in comparative perspective. China, India, Brazil, Germany, and ASEAN. And we, of course, look at these countries across the three issue areas of security and cooperation, diplomacy and governance, and health and human capital. And our last event for this semester will be actually next week, which will be on health and superpowers. So tune in for that as well. And I'm going to turn it over to my fellow colleague at the Rising Powers Initiative, who's an expert affiliate and an associate professor of international relations at Boston University, Professor Kaija Schilde.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller. I have the pleasure today of moderating this event and introducing our speakers and our guests. We have two. Our first speaker and guest for the panel is Rachel Rizzo. She's the director of programs at the Truman Center and the Truman National Security Project, and also an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security working on the Transatlantic Security Program. Her research and expertise is on European security, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship. She also recently spent a year in Berlin as a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow, where she served as a visiting fellow at the German Bundestag and in the Berlin office of Human Rights Watch. She was also, and I want to mention this, I don't usually mention past employment, but she at Center for New American Security, she was the Andrew Bacevich Jr. Fellow. And I say that because Professor Bacevich was our former department chair here at BU. And so I want to welcome her to this. And then also we have Oliver Stuenkel. He is an associate professor at the School of International Relations at FGV in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He's also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a non-resident fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. And his research focuses on geopolitics and global order, asking questions about U.S.-China relations, Brazilian foreign policy, and Latin American politics. He's written books on the rise of the Global South, the BRICS, and the future of global order, and also most recently a provocative book called The Post-Western World: How Emerging Powers Are Remaking Global Order. We also, on the agenda, we were also going to welcome Avinash Palawal from SOAS, University of London, as a speaker on South Asia, giving a perspective on the role of India as a rising power and Indian institution building efforts with other states. And he was not able to attend today for family emergency reasons. And so this was unplanned, but I've asked Professor Miller. Professor Miller and I are going to stay on the call so that we can join our guests in a conversation and enjoy speaking to them together. Because Professor Miller herself, she is the director of the Rising Powers Initiative at BU. She works on foreign policy, security, and rising powers with a focus on South and East Asia. And she just recently published a book called Why Nations Rise: Narratives and the Path to Great Power. So you can see why I asked her to stay on for this conversation. So I have so many thoughts about how this conversation and where I hope this conversation will go and what I hope to learn today. But the framing that I gave our guests to think about and to talk about is that we think about the largest emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, as the economic stars of the last decade and few decades. And these rising powers, we talk about them, there's a word for them, the BRICS. We think of them as both growing economies and rising world powers. But when we talk about them as rising powers, not just in economic terms about their growth, but when we talk about them as political actors, it's often via the fact that they have amplified their role and status internationally by becoming stakeholders and supporters of international rules and institutions. And so a lot of this is tied back to economic power. With growing economic weight, they can demand a larger role in major global governance institutions. They've also shown their ability to be spoilers, to promote and or veto global negotiations in things like security, trade, or climate change. And then the provocative thing also to add to this conversation is, what about states like Germany or like the European Union itself. People wouldn't call them rising powers, and they don't even really call themselves rising powers, but they also have comparable economic rise and weight in the world in terms of market power. And they also have played a significant role in creating, maintaining, and operating through international institutions. Maybe not for status reasons, but for other reasons, and it's worth exploring. So I've asked the speakers today to reflect on their research or their insights, from these different positions globally about how power, status, in international institutions have been traditionally perceived from the perspective of these rising powers, and what has changed recently, what political developments they can identify as significant in this phenomenon or recent. And so I'd like to start with Oliver Stuenkel first, and then Rachel Rizzo.
Kaija, sorry, Oliver, before you start, a quick reminder about the questions that people can submit.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. So for the viewers today, we encourage and look forward to your questions. And you can do that in 3 different ways. And I'll write it in the chat as well when I'm done talking. You can submit questions on YouTube, and our communications director, John Perdanto, will write them down and give them to us. You can also email them to pardee@bu.edu, or you can tweet them to the BU Pardee Center, and I'll write all 3 ways in the chat.
Sounds good. So shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, Manjari and Kaija, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion here. And I'll start by making 5 initial provocations very briefly so that we can then move on to the debate. The first is Brazil actually, does Brazil belong into this group at all? And what has it done to earn it? And it's interesting that over the past 4 decades of my life in Brazil, we started out of Brazil being a larger economy than China. When I was born, Brazil was ahead of China. Then the 80s were a complete lost decade. It's actually remembered as a lost decade. The 90s were sort of okay, consolidated democracy, and economically speaking, somewhat mediocre. The 2000s were just great. Brazil was the second largest contributor to global growth in the world. And the tens were actually worse than the lost decade of the 80s. So Brazil has, over the past 10 years, grown 0.3% per year, which is a disaster. So half of my lifetime, the country has been actually submerging. And the question is, should we consider it to be a rising power? And what are exactly the elements that qualify Brazil as such? And what's really interesting, particularly sort of between 2003 and 2013, which is really the decade when Brazil was up and coming, very confident, full of ideas, there was a big debate in Brazil about whether Brazil was actually willing to take on the responsibilities that rising powerdom entails, and whether it was ready to also, finance a global leadership and global responsibility, which is not for free. And one of the really interesting comments I remember from that time is when, in a private meeting with BRICS foreign ministers, there was a discussion we had with Brazilian diplomats, and one said, Brazil belongs into the league of sort of significant powers. He didn't use great powers, which has a different connotation, or it doesn't fit in Portuguese, but he said it belongs to that group not because of what it does, but because of what it is. And I thought that was quite interesting, because it shows that a lot of people in Brazil, and also I think that's reflected in the way the country sees itself, considers Brazil as a significant or a relevant global actor just by being Brazil. There's nothing specifically it needs to do to qualify, which I think is something one can question, but it's a reality in the public debate. And I think that sets the BRICS countries a bit apart because you have that in India, I think you have that in China, in Russia, and it's sort of embraced with a naturalness that you don't have in Mexico or Argentina or other countries, which kind of sometimes look to Brazil and say they're a bit, preposterous or arrogant. But that's something I think that's clearly there. And that's why I think it makes sense to discuss Brazil in the Rising Powers group, even though its economic performance has been dismal over the past 10 years. The second idea is that Brazil's engagement in international institutions and international order has been driven throughout history by the fact that it's large and very vulnerable and very weak and consistently very concerned about outside interference, and that its emphasis on institutions, rules, and norms was seen as its best bet, given the very difficult situation it found itself in. I think the other element that has driven Brazil's very pro-multilateral drive over the past 120 years was constant status anxiety, because, as I said before, it's a country that considers itself to be, deserving of recognition, but it doesn't really have that recognition from an institutional point of view. So when you look at, and this is not just a recent thing, this is Brazil at the Hague Conference in 1907, fighting for each country to have, status. This is Brazil trying to be on the Executive Council of the League of Nations. This is Brazil begging Roosevelt to be a permanent member on the UN Security Council after World War II, and consistently sort of being frustrated because things didn't really work out that way. It wasn't really considered as a key player by the United States in the way that Western Europe was. There was no Marshall Plan for Brazil. And that's what I call sort of the long road of frustration, which was revived during the more recently when Brazil, failed to get on the UN Security Council. It's part of the G4, which is interesting because the G4 includes countries that Brazil doesn't really consider to be rising powers, like Germany or Japan. Brazil also wasn't fully happy with the reform of voting structures in Bretton Woods of the World Bank and the IMF. And there was, when Brazil was invited to the G7 meeting in about 15 years ago in Evian in France, Lula, at the time president, said, I feel like we were invited for snacks, but I want to be here not only having snacks and starters, I want to have the main course and dessert and coffee. So what he said is, we don't feel fully recognized as relevant rising powers, and I think the Brazil's turn towards informals, BRICS, IBSA, and then sort of the BRICS Development Bank, Brazil's very enthusiastic participation in the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, are all signs of, the perception that the system was rigged, that the system is actually rigged. There's no space. And that's the third point I want to make. A sense that this talk about, Eikenberry saying the order is open, easy to join, hard to overturn, that's not really true. And the reaction in the policy establishment in Brazil when the French insisted on leading the IMF again, and the United States again sort of insisted on having the World Bank president being a U.S. American citizen, that I think played a huge role for Brazil to say, we will not abandon those, but we do need a plan B. And I think that was many times, misunderstood as being sort of revolutionary or revisionist. Brazil was never revisionist at all. It never, it has no plans to abolish the UN Security Council and say, let's have the General Assembly rule. That would be revolutionary. Brazil doesn't want that. It wants to be part of the oligarchy. So it's not against hierarchy per se, but it feels like it should be higher up in that hierarchy. And that has led to, I think that has been one of the key drivers of the way Brazil projects itself. Now, the fourth thing, the informals that Brazil has started to be part of are, of course, much, much less institutionalized, but they have given Brazil, they've acted like as a status booster. And BRICS has been tremendously helpful with that, because Brazil has been really through tough times over the past years. We've had nonstop political instability, which has led a lot of other heads of state to think twice before they would meet the Brazilian president. Even under Temer, before Bolsonaro, a lot of people didn't want to meet Temer because they said, we don't know if this guy will be in power 2 weeks from now. We didn't know, right? So, but the only ones who would say, we will meet you and we have this everybody smiling photo op are the BRICS leaders. Even now, Bolsonaro completely isolated in the West, the BRICS will be happy to meet him, even though he's quite anti-China. So in that sense, Brazil feels that its contributions to international order, leading peacekeeping troops in Haiti, providing funds to development banks, etc., wasn't really given sufficient recognition in the established organizations, and that's why I think it sought alternative institutions, which explain why Brazil today has a fairly predictable and institutionalized relationship to BRICS countries, which were completely non-existent 20 years ago, right? And that, I think, also reflects itself in the entire climate debate. No Western leader today would take a picture with President Bolsonaro. We know that his only meetings will be with the BRICS countries, which will take pictures of them no matter what. And that, of course, also interests Russia's president in that sense. And the final issue is what's happening right now. How can we make sense of Brazil's current strategy, which is very, very different from anything we've seen over the past 120 years. And I think it's still a bit too early. We can really start only to make sense of Bolsonaro's foreign policy once he's left office. But it's, of course, an influence of sort of anti-globalist ideas, very much influenced by Trump, which leaves Brazil in a very difficult position now that Trump is gone. But in a way, I think some things have, continue. It's not all rupture, it's also some continuity. And that is in particular Brazil's reluctance to take sides in the context of great power tensions, growing great power tensions, where even though we have a very pro-American or pro-Trump president, in the end, the country has been very, very careful to not be seen as taking sides in this dynamic, this great power dynamic, which is increasingly impacting politics in Latin America. When Trump threatened to invade Venezuela, Brazil sided with Venezuela's president, along with all the other Latin American countries, because it didn't want to set a precedent of US troops on the ground in South America. And even though Bolsonaro is very pro-American, anti-China, the country in the end accepted the participation of Huawei in the construction of its 5G networks. So a lot of rhetoric there, but in the end, sort of, I think particularly armed forces and foreign policymakers are currently assuring that the country is seeking this uneasy balance between those two great powers, which are increasingly interested in enhancing their influence in the region. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to, before turning it over to Rachel Rizzo, interject that when I realized over the last week that we were going to be making a lot of direct comparisons between Brazil and Germany/Europe, I was initially uncomfortable, but now I'm really inspired by all the multidimensional, differences in trajectories, differences in position, differences in subjectivities of roles in the world, and I really look forward to the rest of this conversation. So, Rachel Rizzo, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to this panel. It's been really interesting so far. It's Oliver, listening to you speak about how Brazil looks at things like institutions and rules and norms. It's very German-like. So I think that we are going to be able to draw a lot of comparisons here. So Kaija, you mentioned a few things in sort of your opening statement about power and status and international institutions and how things are perceived. from these various states. And so I think for Germany, a good place to start is how the word power is understood and perceived from a German point of view. And I think to understand that and to see how Germany views it, you really have to go back and look a couple years back in history. So from German unification into the German Empire in 1871 until around the middle of the 20th century, European politics as a whole were really characterized by more and more competition among great powers that were pretty much around the same size. And all of these powers were driven by a couple things, basically an ambition to dominate other powers and a consistent fear of being conquered. And so Germany, for its part, was really at the core of this geopolitical struggle and tried to reshape the political order in Europe. And as we know, that had devastating results. They tried it twice. So since World War II, really the opposite has happened in Germany. And it's been quite reticent to be a power in the geopolitical sense of the word. And some have even written that it identifies more as being an anti-power, which I think is correct. Germany is confronted by this somewhat debilitating dilemma that if it acts as a power or an emerging power, it will revive old fears that Germany wants to reassert its supremacy in Europe. And there's still a lot of arguments in the transatlantic space about this, especially in regards to its participation in NATO and its military. So Germany has built basically this political identity and this political system on the concept of being the opposite of what it was around World War II. And so that history, that desire to leave that history behind really does permeate German society. And I didn't really understand the extent to which that occurs until I lived there and was in these conversations about NATO, about the EU, about the transatlantic relationship, and really started understanding firsthand what this comes from. And it really isn't, it's not a debate amongst, realism and pacifism. It's more so this debate against realism and Wilsonianism, I think. And this has been a fact that a lot of leaders within the transatlantic community have looked to. So look back in 2011, the then foreign minister of Poland, Radoslaw Sikorski, had a really interesting quote while he was speaking in Berlin, where he said that today I'm not so much afraid of German power, it's German inactivity I'm starting to fear. And not to get too cliche, but we also remember the Henry Kissinger missive about Germany, which is that it's too big for Europe, but too small for the world. So that doesn't mean, though, that Germany today is not a powerful state. It very much is. It is arguably the most powerful state within the EU, and its power lies primarily in its economic strength and within the European Union, on its ability to get along with its European neighbors, on its ability to cooperate closely with those neighbors. And so I think a lot can be frustrating, but as long as German power is embedded within the EU, it is acceptable to Berlin's European partners. If Europe were to fear anything related to Germany today, it's Germany as an economic state rather than its military might and capabilities, which are actually quite lacking. So over the last 10 years or so, we've really seen Germany start to flex its muscles at the EU level. It dominated the response to the Eurozone debt crisis and the recent COVID-19 relief package, which I do think is worth touching on because it's a really interesting way to see how Germany's economic approach affects the European Union. Merkel was at the forefront of the response to the migrant crisis of 2015, which could require its entirely own panel discussion. Germany's relationship with China basically drives the continent's entire approach to China. So its support and pushing of the comprehensive agreement on investments, its approach to 5G and Huawei. And then more recently, it's trying to finish Nord Stream 2, the pipeline between Russia and Germany, which really is, I think, the first, I would say, transatlantic crisis of the Biden era. You see Germany at the center of these discussions. And so when it comes to the EU, where Germany is able to be an economic power, that's really where it thrives. And that's where other EU nations like France and before Brexit, the UK really tried to balance that out. NATO, Germany's participation in NATO, on the other hand, I think is a different story. We all remember how Trump talked about Germany at NATO, how he had it out for Angela Merkel and consistently harped on her constantly for not being able to meet defense spending threshold, for free riding on American security guarantees. Basically, he spent 4 years talking about how Germany wasn't living up to its expectations within NATO. And he wasn't the first US president to do so. This has been a constant theme of US presidencies going back a couple decades. And not to get political, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I don't think you can deny that Germany just hasn't been able to drum up the public support to really increase defense investments in their defense. And I think it's also good to remember that giving every member of the Bundeswehr a raise is an easy way to do it, but that doesn't count. Germany really does need better capabilities to take up the mantle of leadership within NATO that I think it needs to take up. But again, that goes back to history, and I think it is beyond time that Germany let go of those historical fears. I think going forward, Germany really does need to marry up institutional differences and come up with a broad vision for its country, basically create a plan that has social acceptance, that can see Germany as a powerful actor that it is, and see Germany as an organization that has sway in the UN, that has sway in NATO, and that can really shape the relationship between the United States and Europe, and to the east, the relationship between the United States, or between the European Union and China. And so I think that's where I'll stop, but I think it's a sort of a good thing to end on in terms of economics and what that looks like going forward.
Fantastic. Thanks to both of you. I have kind of an observation that occurred to me while Oliver was talking first. And I wanted to pose it, and then I wanted to ask kind of specific questions to each of you going forward, and then open it up to audience questions. And the observation that while Oliver was talking was that he, from a Brazilian perspective, from kind of a decentered perspective, from the perspective of a rising state, he called the states that sit at the table of international organizations kind of the oligarchs, which I thought was such an interesting image, because that's where I thought, well, Germany and, well, not Germany itself, but European states in this way are oligarchs, in international institutions. They inherited these international institutions at moments of their relatively declining power, but they operated not as the greatest powers. And so I think that's so interesting that we can look at almost a two trajectories intersecting there. I'm not saying that European states are declining. It's just that they aren't, you wouldn't call them the oligarchs they were, especially France or the UK, when they inherited these seats at the center of, say, the UN Security Council, or in driving forces in NATO and things like that. And so I just wanted to re-ask, I wanted to say that, but I also wanted to reflect on some of these questions of our current international institutions. I thought it was also interesting, and Rachel, I'm going to pivot to more Germany-specific questions too, but related to Oliver's comment, I think it's interesting that you said that Brazil has never been interested in being revolutionary, never truly interested in creating an alternate order. And I'm wondering if you could expand on, and if Rachel also wants to comment on, the risk of alternate orders right now, informal or formal. There are a lot of informal reactions to the current international institutions that we have, but we also have, especially and when we talk about Europe and Trump, the attempts to create alternate informal orders, like in response to the Iran deal and things like that. And, a big question on the European side is how real that is and how enduring it is, or whether it was a temporary reaction to the Trump era. And then the larger question is, what do you see as a potential tipping point here in terms of what could actually prompt the creation of a little bit more revolutionary thinking, or actual alternate orders? Oliver, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Actually, I just wanted to say first, as Rachel was speaking, I was reminded of sort of the most important Brazilian foreign minister, the Baron of Rio Branco, who was an avid reader of history. And when he designed Brazil's relationship to its neighbors, he looked at European history and how Richelieu in France had sort of created this web of allies which had allowed countries around Germany to keep Germany sort of down, because he knew that once Germany would unite, it would become a threat to the region. And Rio Branco said, what Brazil needs to avoid is that there will be an alliance, anti-Brazil alliance in South America, in the same way that the French have been able to make Germany's unification more difficult. And as a consequence, Brazil has virtually no historic engagement with its neighbors, because the goal was always never to produce any kind of movement that could be interpreted as threatening in the region. So I think in that sense, Brazil and Germany are very similar. Brazil represents 50% of the territory, GDP, and population of South America, and yet it has never been seen as a threat, in part because it doesn't articulate any kind of grand vision, which could, if you read it in the wrong way, be seen as a threat by Ecuador, Peru, all the other countries in the region. So that's a really fascinating parallel. I was just sort of, I just realized as I was speaking to Rachel, as I was hearing Rachel speak. Regarding the your question, Kaija, I think that, as I said, Brazil looks at the order as a way to protect itself and other weak countries from the mighty sort of and the strong. And the criticism Brazil has traditionally had is not really the rules and norms per se, but the way they're being utilized and the way they're being selectively interpreted by those who can make very important decisions, like the United States, of whether or not to invade Libya, how to interpret the responsibility to protect. At that stage, Brazil was very active in during the Libya intervention, and actually launched the concept of the responsibility while protecting, which was basically a series of aspects that had to be taken into consideration while an R2P intervention was going on, in order to not sort of to control the country that was actually intervening, because Brazil always knew that it could be part of these discussions, but once those things were going on, it would be on the sidelines, because it doesn't have the military power to actually implement these kinds of things. So I think the way to look at this, or the way Brazil looks at this, is to constrain the powerful, to reduce the potentially negative effects of a large concentration of power, of unipolarity. Brazil, for example, was very concerned at the end of the Cold War, not because it liked the Soviet Union, but because it believed that international order would struggle much more to constrain the United States once there was no other great power there to constrain the United States, right? So, so I think it's that, but it also looks at this order and knows that without sort of pressure from the global South, this order would not look like it does today. That sort of the egalitarian elements are not part of Western enlightened thought, sort of saying, okay, now we want to give more power to recently independent states, but because this was the result of constant pressure on the former oligarchs or whatever to sort of to hand over more voting rights, etc. And in the sense, the desire to push for ending the gentleman's agreement, which always gives a European citizen the top spot at the IMF, is part of that struggle to make international order more reflective of the real, quote unquote, distribution of power in the world. Now, what's the risk, or what would be the tipping point of alternative orders emerging? I cannot see Brazil abandoning the existing structures in any event. It's now got this, Trumpian strategy, which I consider to be temporary, particularly because there's no immediate prospect of Trump returning, and it's just not viable for a weak state like the United States, like Brazil, to have an anti-globalist strategy without swimming in the slipstream of an anti-globalist US president. But what I do think is that Brazil is clearly sort of saying this is an order where there's no clear path towards equality. The UN Security Council will not change. There's no illusion in Brazil that a country that, like France, and they may sort of rhetorically support it. But interestingly enough, the countries that most block reform are Russia and China. But at the same time, Brazil will massively engage in these new institutions because they provide advantages like, BRICS, which doesn't ask uncomfortable questions about human rights abuses and environmental destruction. And in that sense, I think it will always sort of be present, as we say, sort of on both parties, without a risk, I think, that we'll entirely abandon one, but always sort of balance it out.
Thank you. And actually, before I turn to Rachel, there was a question from the audience that fits a version of what I just asked to Rachel. And the question is, it references the Alliance for Multilateralism recently created by Germany and France together to kind of fill the gaps in some global governance issues around human rights, public health, cybersecurity, some less governed spaces. The question asks whether it can avert the Kindleberger trap, which is the international institutions or hegemons not providing enough governance, after creating their institutions, basically not governing enough. Or is it just a talk shop and a momentary response to Trump? So I thought that I would interject that because it kind of fits my question towards Europe is to what degree European states are genuinely creating alternate orders or whether they're just filling the gaps. And then this question kind of asks what the effectiveness is here and longevity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting topic. When you think of Germany believes deeply in an ever closer European Union. And as the European Union started to include other countries that might not have been as democratically solid as some of the Northern European countries were, I'm thinking of countries like Hungary and Poland, and in NATO, Turkey, which is another country that we have to seriously talk about, I think, that the multilateral institution and the democratic values that those countries or those institutions espouse, and which makes them function as powers on the global stage, that becomes more difficult to control. I think the EU is a really good example of a bloc of countries who are trying to be more forward-leaning geopolitically, but can be hamstrung at times by countries within the bloc that might not be as on democratically solid footing or as economically strong as countries like France and Germany. I think what's interesting is that from a US standpoint, for really since the end of the Cold War, you have had US presidents consistently say that the European Union should be a stronger actor on the US stage, that it should do more, that it needs to be more forward-leaning. And I think that we've seen the European Union do that recently. Last fall, I believe it was, when Mike Pompeo at the UN said that he was going to put on the snapback sanctions on Iran, you really saw pushback from Europeans on that. You saw the Europeans attempt to create a financial vehicle to sidestep US sanctions when it came to the Iran deal. You've also seen efforts at a closer union on European defense efforts, the permanent structured cooperation, which, it's a question whether or not that's actually going to go anywhere, but I think it's a good step. And then most recently, you saw before the Biden administration came into office, the current National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan basically asked Europe to wait on signing the comprehensive agreement on investment with China to wait for the Biden administration to get into office. Let's talk about it and see where it goes. And obviously, after 7 years of negotiation, I don't really think that was going to happen. So we've seen efforts at Europe try to do more and try to be a more global actor. But then at the same time, what ends up happening in the US context is that we always push back. We always push back on Europe and complain when they do things that we don't like, even though we've asked them to do more for decades. And so I do think that there's always this push and pull between Europe and the United States that really is going to stop Europe from creating a different order with a country like China to its east. But it is going to create a situation where we are going, and I say we, I mean the United States, we are going to have to come to terms with the fact that the EU is going to do things as it becomes a more forward-leaning and free-thinking actor that we may not agree with. And so I could foresee more issues in that space over the next 4 years.
Can I get in a question over here, because I think this is such an interesting conversation. So it's interesting because I think both Oliver and Rachel have brought up these two parallel tracks, right? So on one track, you have this idea of alternate order, right? Rising powers having the clout to create alternate order. And then you are creating that alternate order through new institutions, right? So how can institutions be utilized to create an alternate order? And there, if I followed both of you correctly, Oliver and Rachel, you're both saying that, look, Germany and Brazil punch under their weight with respect to that, right? But then you have the use of institutions, current institutions, not to create alternate order, but to essentially gain greater clout within the current international order. And the reason I'm thinking about this is I'm really thinking about India. Pre-Cold War and post-Cold War, right? So pre-Cold War, India institutionalizes the non-aligned movement, right? And that's not alternate order, but it's certainly also not the Cold War order, right? You have this third way that is joining neither superpower, even though India eventually leans towards the Soviet Union. So you have this bona fide institutionalization of an ideology that's, let's say, a suborder, if not an alternative order, right? But then post-Cold War, what India does is, what it continues to do is engage in institutions which are seen as prestigious, right? And China does that too. So, Courtney Fung, who's an associate professor at the University of Hong Kong, has written extensively, for example, on peacekeeping, right? So China sends more peacekeeping troops than all of the P5 combined, and India sends double that of China's. Right? And that is really more about using current institutions to gain prestige, right? So how would you see, I guess, Germany and Brazil's roles on these parallel tracks, especially because, Oliver, there have been articles written particularly about Brazil and how Brazil has, really powerful negotiation style in international institutions and punches above its weight, right? There's the whole famous Miles Collar article from a few years ago about how Brazil is able to build coalitions within institutions that are much more effective than, say, the ones China and India actually cobbles together. So I'm just going to throw that out there because I see this conversation as going on parallel tracks, right? So institutions to push alternate order, but then the use of institutions to basically shore up status and prestige. And one could argue that that's what Germany's been doing, for example, right, with various international institutions as well. And I'll stop there. Sorry, Kai, I didn't mean to jump in with the question, but this is such an interesting conversation.
No, and I wanted to add to that because I wanted to push Oliver specifically about his previous work calling the current international order parochial, European parochial. And I wanted to see if I could push that a little bit, because if it is parochial, is that I wanted to relate that to Manjri's question.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. To what extent, what is sort of Brazil's aim when it seeks to engage in those institutions? And there's been a lot of criticism too. For example, even within Brazil, when you look at Brazil's behavior at trade negotiations, for example, where 20 years ago you had the emergence of sort of stronger alignment with India, for example. In the end, from what many in Brazil thought, the final result was much more what India wanted than what Brazil was actually aiming for. But it was sort of, I think, there was a sense that, you know, it wasn't really exactly how we wanted it to turn out, but at least we showed them we have sort of the blocking minority. We were able to, you can no longer ignore us, even though it's very hard to have it our way. And I think that there's been certainly a concern, I think, to be seen and recognized as such, even though in the vast majority of cases, if you look at the actual results, it's been highly questionable, right? And I think many times based on also strategic mistakes made in Brazil, when, for example, the country, despite massive internal security challenges, decided to lead MINUSTAH, peacekeeping troops in Haiti, thinking that that may somehow increase Brazil's chances of becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which never really was a realistic option in that sense. So I think that Manjay, so it's quite interesting that with the non-alignment movement, Brazil, and in that sense is actually quite similar to Germany. There was a big meeting between Brazil, the German foreign minister, and Latin American foreign ministers 2 years ago. And the big debate was, how do we navigate this new bipolar great power competition? I mean, that wasn't the explicit, but the underlying theme was that. And the German foreign minister basically said, we're in the same boat. We both need to sort of address these multiple issues, which from his rhetoric, of course, was another argument in order to ratify the trade agreement, which is currently under scrutiny, which would tie those two blocs, Mercosur and the European Union, together. Regarding whether the order is parochial, yeah, I think that there is, and I think that extends to the global South, this idea that not enough has been done to adapt the order, and that as long as it resists to adequately reflect a new distribution of power, which I think is, you know, more weight to the global South, but above all, more weight to Asia in general, the risk of alternative orders emerging increases. And I would say that a lot of, and again, I'm actually supportive of Brazil's position that it's no longer tenable to have an iron rule that all the heads of the World Bank must be American, all the heads of the IMF must be French, for example. That a lot of this could be attenuated, I think, through symbolism to give more voice. Because once you give more voice to countries like Brazil, they will have to position themselves, and they will be forced also to provide more international public goods, which hasn't always been the case. Just like Germany, Brazil, if you actually look at its sort of tangible contributions, I'm not so sure if it's actually punching below its weight. I mean, right now, Brazil is so unstable that it's, I think, has very limited capacity to actually take on real responsibility on the international stage.
Thanks so much, Oliver. And I want to turn to Rachel. And Rachel, we only have 8 minutes left, and I know we have a hard end at 11. So I'm going to welcome you to answer Manjari's question, but I also wanted to ask a couple more loaded on there. One is just that I don't know if you could, before the end, comment on some of what observers of German politics have observed, that there is just a very interesting disconnect, and kind of there's a oddness to the debate inside Germany about Germany's role in the world, because there are so many commentators and growing think tanks in Berlin with a lot of strategic thought, you know, with their goal and their agenda is Germany's role in the world. And Oliver's also associated with GPPI. And so those of us who know Germany know that this is actually a healthy debate. But there's a disconnect between that kind of elite debate or strategic thought debate and the rest of domestic politics, both elite and popular. And you can see that tension also play out on a lot of EU affairs and a lot of things that appear to be puzzling from the outside, such as Germany's role in COVID response and recovery. So, Rachel.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and the debate is raging. There's been many topics or many think tank pieces written about this. But to talk a little bit about the Germany as an actor and how it wields its power a little bit within the EU, I think what's important to, you can listen to Germany talk about values and multilateralism and the European project and ever closer union, or conversely, you can just observe their behavior, which I think is a better way to measure the country as an actor within the European Union. They've structured parts of the European continent around them to serve their industries. They think that the EU works well with Germany as its core engine. Their response to the Eurozone debt crisis was a really clear indicator of how they see themselves as part of a larger economic engine. And at the end of the day, the Germans believe that handouts to poorer European countries like Greece and like Italy is, to put it in an American sense, welfare, which is why I think the COVID-19 relief package was such an amazing accomplishment from an EU level, because they finally talked about this Hamiltonian moment, because for the first time it included provisions for the EU to raise debt on their own. And it was really hard to get Germany on board with this. This goes against basically everything that Germany believes at its core as in a European economic actor. And so you really do see it. I said in my opening remarks that Germany is reticent to take on this role as a power, but you see its power on the stage all the time when it comes to discussions in Brussels and at the EU level. I will add one thing. I think that the EU COVID response has been a huge disaster. And I think that it goes to show how the EU would struggle as a really global actor if it did have those ambitions, because it just gets hamstrung by its 27 members all the time. So I think it's probably a conversation for a different day. But you're right. In Germany, in Berlin, there is a discussion about Germany taking on, this strategic culture, emerging as the leader, as the global power that it really is. But there's a disconnect there. And I think it really does come down to the German psyche. And I think that's difficult, because you have we have a federal election coming up in September, and you're seeing the rise of the Green Party, which is, will require much more focus on things like climate. And if there is going to be progress made in that area, Germany is going to need to lead. And so you sort of have this disconnect where if Germany is going to help make the world a more inhabitable place, and you see that the German public wants this because of their support for the Greens, they are going to need to sort of let go of this aversion to being a global power, but it just hasn't happened yet. Although many people are writing about it, many people are pushing it. And so I think we'll have to wait and see what happens over the next few years to see how that goes.
Thank you. Marjorie, Oliver, did you want to respond at all before we end?
I'm going to cede my time to Oliver, actually, if he has a wrap-up statement.
No, I mean, I just wanted to say, this is, as Kaija, as you've said, it's a somewhat unusual comparison to make. And I think it's funny, because I came into this discussion thinking Brazil is kind of the odd one out, whereas you sort of said, well, Germany isn't necessarily seen as a rising power. And one really interesting aspect is that the United States is set to grow 6-point-something% this year, which is, I think, more than any of the major powers, whereas Brazil is really falling behind in that sense. And just as a sort of forward-looking comment, I think this idea of a K-shaped recovery, which provides a lot of benefits to those who successfully contain the virus, but also vaccinate very quickly, recovering very quickly, whereas those struggling to contain and vaccinate will sort of submerge, raises a lot of interesting questions about the future of rising powers, because particularly India, but even more Brazil, I think, are struggling enormously and may actually pay a price for several years with significant geopolitical consequences for them as well.
Thank you. That was a depressing but important note to end on. That this relationship between economic growth and being a rising power may become unlinked, as you say, it already has in Brazil for a decade or two. Okay, thank you so much to our guests and to our director. And if anybody missed part of this, it will be streamed on and hosted on YouTube. And so I look forward to further conversations on this topic, and I appreciated our discussion. I thought it was fascinating and so rich for further conversation.
Thank you so much for joining.